I'm Bruce Shapiro. I direct the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and am lucky enough to be the professor for at least some of you here. I want to welcome you to our, what is now the third annual all-school reading and conversation. The year here, the master's year, is so intense, and the work of reporters is so intense, that we very rarely get the chance to step back and really go under the hood with masterworks of journalism and reverse engineer them and figure out how they work, figure out what the reporting method is, figure out what the ethical challenges have been and how they've been overcome, and how the narrative is put together, to really learn from our peers and learn from our mentors and masters. That's the point of this all-school reading. Once in the year, to step back, look at a great work of journalism together. For those of you who are not students at the school, for the last week or so, everyone here in the room, many of the people here, have been meeting in small groups with faculty members to talk about this year's book. And now we're here with my friend, Anne Fadiman, the author of The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, Hmong Child, Her American Doctors, and the Collision of Two Cultures. As we were coming up here, Anne pointed out to me that this year, in fact this month, is the 20th anniversary of the publication of The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. And this is the 30th anniversary of her first. It's been 30 years since she first began working on this project and with the community described in this book. I know from the conversations we've had in our small seminars thus far that this is going to be a rich and exciting event. Sheila Carnell, the Dean for Academic Affairs, will begin the conversation with Anne, do a little bit of an introduction, begin the conversation, and then we'll move to questions from all of you. Sheila, take it from here.
Thank you, Bruce. Can you hear me?
You have to turn the mic.
Now can you hear me? Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to have Anne Fadiman with us today. Anne is a well-known author, essayist, editor, and teacher. At Yale, she's the first endowed professor in nonfiction writing. She teaches in the English department and is a mentor to students considering careers in writing and editing. In fact, we have two of her students here with us tonight. So The Spirit Catches You is her first book, and it won the National Book Critics Circle Award. It's widely used as an example, just as it is in our own school, of literary journalism, and also as a case study of cross-cultural sensitivity. It's widely read in medical schools as well, and medical practitioners who wish to offer more effective care to patients from other cultures use it as a sort of manual or a guide. For 7 years, Anne was the editor of the venerable literary quarterly, The American Scholar. She has written for numerous magazines, including The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and Harper's. She has won several national magazine awards. She has published a book about books. If you want to look it up, it's called Ex Libris, Confessions of a Common Reader. And her memoir, The Wine Lover's Daughter, will be published in November. And she told us that she was just doing the audiobook, reading the audiobook herself of the memoir. So Anne, let's start with a very simple question. Take us to the beginning. Where did you get the idea for this book? How did you begin reporting on The Spirit Catches You?
Thank you, Sheila. And first of all, it's just so incredibly exciting to be here today. When this book started almost 30 years ago, it just never would have occurred to me that students at the Columbia School of Journalism, the absolute creme de la creme, would be reading my book and asking me to sign it. Oh my God, if I had looked at that crystal ball, I would have gotten so motivated during my more discouraged moments, of which there were many. It started because I had a college friend who worked in the hospital where Leah's case had taken place. He'd been my brother's freshman year college roommate, the same college I went to. I'd known him for years, and he happened to be the chief resident in family practice at the county hospital in Merced, California. We talked on the phone every few months, and Bill Selvage, during one conversation, started telling me about the Hmong patients who'd come into the hospital and how interesting but how difficult they were. And he didn't mention Leah Lee, but I thought, well, gee, if I could find a case, that might be interesting. And I went out to Merced with an assignment for the New Yorker, and basically slept on Bill's floor on a piece of foam rubber that I got from the hardware store for many, many months.
This was a very ambitious undertaking. I mean, did you know at the start that you were going to write a book? And that
No. You know, if I had, I would have been so intimidated because I knew nothing about Hmong culture. And the more I got into medical culture, the more I realized I didn't know anything about that either. I hadn't even realized it was a culture. So I was basically a complete ignoramus on both fronts. No, I never would have started if I had known it was going to be a book. But for those of you who have the 15th anniversary edition, and if you've read the afterword, you know that I'm actually very grateful for the New Yorker, to the New Yorker for not publishing it. So I finished this 3-part series. I was so excited, I turned it in, and then the editor who had assigned it, Bob Gottlieb, was fired. Not a cause and effect, I don't think. But he was replaced by an editor named Tina Brown, and she was just the least likely editor in the entire universe to want to publish this particular story. But she kept the piece for an entire year before killing it. So I couldn't send it any other place, and then when she finally released it, it was too long to publish in any other magazine, so then I had to make it a book. I had no choice. So I was sort of backed into it. But you know, as I used to have Tina Brown's rejection letter in which she misspelled both my first and last names, and I think that actually takes effort. One could be a mistake, but you know, I think she really put some work into that. And I used to have it on my bulletin board above my desk to remind me that things that seem really bad sometimes can turn out to be really good. You know, it's like that line from the Mother Superior in The Sound of Music where she says, "When God shuts a door, he opens a window." And in this case, Tina Brown wasn't exactly God, but she opened, you know, not just a window, but a giant gate that led to the rest of my whole life. I never would have turned it into a book if she hadn't killed the story.
That is such an encouraging story for our students. So number one, God closes a window but opens a door. So remember that when you're discouraged, when you get your rejection letters. So Anne, you knew nothing about the Hmong. You knew nothing about medical culture.
Nothing.
So how do you enter into a world that you know nothing about?
Well, if I had been either a doctor or a Hmong, it would have been a completely different book, and of course much more knowledgeable, because I would have been able to give the inside scoop on one of those cultures. But I think you also notice some stuff when you write it from the outside that you don't notice from the inside. That's why travel writing is sometimes more interesting than writing done by residents of a place. So I was a traveler to both of those cultures. I had essentially 2 cultural brokers who were my mediators. One was my friend Bill Selvage, so I was staying at his place for months, and he knew everybody at the hospital because he was the chief resident. And I socialized with all of the other young doctors at the hospital. This was a long time ago, and I noticed that the poster that you used to have up here is a photograph from that era. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my God, when I wrote that book, you know, I looked as if I was about 12 years old, and I don't look like that at all anymore. That was a really long time ago. In any case, Bill explained a lot of just medical stuff, jargon to me, introduced me to a lot of people, but mainly I'd see him coming home really exhausted after a 36-hour shift when residents were still allowed to have 36-hour shifts. And he would be really exhausted, especially if he'd been dealing with Hmong patients. And I think it was very important for me to see through his eyes how hard it was to be a doctor, because otherwise I would have done the knee-jerk PC romanticizing thing, and I would have said to myself, oh, those poor, powerless Hmong refugees, they must be the heroes of this story, and, well, if they're heroes on this side, there must be villains on the other, and the doctors would have been the villains. In fact, nobody was a villain, and the Hmong were far from powerless. In fact, they really held all the power in Leah's case. And then, of course, I had my marvelous interpreter / cultural broker, Mei-Ying Zhang, who's still a close friend of mine, as is Bill, who was my main entree into Hmong culture. So just little by little, admitting ignorance in both cultures as I fumbled along.
So one of the questions that were asked in one of our small group discussions was that, how do you do this? How do you go with an open mind, almost bias-free and prejudice-free into a story, while at the same time having empathy for the various people that are involved?
Well, empathy, I think, was at the root of everything, because really, if the story has a theme, its reality looks different depending on where you're standing. And so my goal was to try to explain what happened in this case from these 2 points of view. So I was constantly trying to empathize, but it never occurred to me that I was going in objectively or without bias or prejudice. If the theme is that reality looks different depending on where you are, then where I came from had a tremendous influence on my own view of things, which is why I put myself in as a character. I wanted to make clear that I was friends with people on both sides, which certainly compromised my objectivity. I was very fond of the people on both sides. So my goal was to be accurate and to be fair, but not to be objective.
What part of that educating or traveling was preparing yourself, for that trip? How did you do that? Did you prepare yourself for this, sort of journey into this new territory?
No, I didn't. I just didn't know anything, and I just flew out there, and I just thought, oh, I'm just going to ask a bunch of people and find a case, and at least I have a place to stay. And I didn't know anything. I mean, I remember this is before the internet. You couldn't type in Hmong. I don't know. I'd read a couple articles in National Geographic. I mean, I didn't know anything. I'm not sure preparation helps you. It's more like the preparation of your entire life up to that point, because it was just all about listening, not about knowing. They were the ones on both sides who knew. And I was the one who was going to listen.
How did you explain to people you were talking to what it is exactly that you were doing?
Oh, that's a really good question. Of course, with the doctors, it wasn't difficult. With the Lee family, it was really hard because they didn't know how to read. They didn't read in either Hmong or English. They were pre-literate rather than illiterate. It's an important distinction in vocabulary, I think. In our culture, if you're illiterate, you don't know how to read, but everybody around you does. So it's a true handicap. But if you're pre-literate, let's say you live in a village in Laos before the Vietnam War, and nobody else in the village reads either, so it's not a handicap. And also, you become incredibly good at telling stories. Just imagine how good you would get at oral narrative if the only way to transmit your culture was to tell stories so interesting that your children would remember them and tell them to their children. So I really learned a lot about telling a story from the Leahs.
So when did they know you were writing a book? I mean, did you tell them that it was going to be about them?
I said,
characters?
I did. I said, I'm telling a story about you. I brought them a copy of The New Yorker, which they couldn't read, just so they could see, here's this thing. And I said, I want to be able to tell the story of what happened to your daughter from your point of view so that other people can understand it. This very much fit with their agenda. That is, they felt that Leah had not been treated well by the hospital. They felt she was a very valuable person and still was, even though she was in a vegetative state when I first met her and had been for about a year. They felt there were all kinds of things that had been completely misconstrued and misunderstood, and that if they could just tell their side of things, maybe some doctors would read it and be more sensitive if a little girl like Leah were to come into a hospital. Well, that agenda was really similar to mine and also really similar to the doctor's agenda. And they were such good storytellers, they absolutely understood the notion, well, in order to make something understood, you have to tell the story, and it has to have lots of details. So I think we were surprisingly aligned, even though I knew they would never be able to read the result.
How did you get them to trust you to tell their story?
People are always saying, well, gosh, how many weeks of painstaking strategizing was it before they actually said something useful? I mean, there was no strategizing, and they said useful stuff the first time I saw them. There's stuff in the book that they said on the first night. It was partly because my interpreter, Mei Ying, was fantastic, and her husband was a member of their clan, and her father had been a famous Sineng, a shaman. He had died, and his legend lived on in the community. So she, just being trailing after her, made things much easier for me. But I just made a connection with them, not by figuring anything out, but I just really liked them, and they wanted to tell me about Leah. They started, and she was right there, and they started talking about her right away, and their amazingly strong love for her was just so obvious. So, I mean, it wasn't that I did anything. It was more that there were some things I didn't do. So I didn't have to see them in the hospital like the doctors, and I didn't have to be a coercive figure like the doctors or the people in the courts, telling them to do stuff that they didn't want to do. And I wasn't trying to pretend that I knew more about their daughter than they did, as they felt the doctors had made them feel, because of course I didn't. So they were my hosts, and they were very warm, hospitable people who were still incredibly important in my life. And I was their ignorant guest that they felt a little bit sorry for and were trying to take care of and enlighten and teach a little Hmong culture to, and eventually marry off.
So, which they tried to do.
Oh, which they successfully did. That was not a mere attempt.
So, I mean, being a guest and having that relationship, wasn't there the expectation that you would tell the story their way?
I don't know. They never said, and they haven't read the book. And of course, all they know is what their children told them when their children read the book, but I don't know exactly what their children told them, because once I finished the book, thank God, when I visit them now, I'm not a reporter. I don't have to ask them questions. I don't come with a notebook or a tape recorder. We're just friends. So I would never ask them, which of your children told you about the book, and what did they tell you? But when I was writing it, I couldn't worry about whether either the Hmong family or the doctors were going to like it. I just had to write it. And some of the things that I'd worried about turned out just not to be problems at all. I was really worried that the Leahs would be offended because I said that Nao Cao had cheated on his driver's exam. But he was actually really proud of that because it showed how smart and strategic it wasn't, because he just hated bureaucracy, and he thought that all good people hated bureaucracy and would be on his side. So that wasn't an issue at all. There were some little things that some more minor characters ended up being hurt by, but generally not what I would have expected.
How did you verify their stories. What is people's memories are faulty. They take, if
Exactly.
you are biased when you are part of the story yourself. How did you balance what they said
Right.
with
Okay.
yeah.
Well, actually, a ton of the stuff was absolutely verifiable because I had access to all of Leah's medical and legal records.
How did you
How
get
do I
that?
get it? Okay. Well, first of all, I could never do this book now. I would never want to do this book now because back then there wasn't very much written about the Hmong. I could read it all, and I don't know, it took me a couple of years, which was completely insane, but still it was pretty much everything. But now it would take me a lifetime, plus there are many marvelous young Hmong writers who are currently working, and I'm much more interested in reading what they have to say than in writing about them myself anymore. But one other reason why I could never do it now is that there are many privacy rules that exist now that didn't exist then.
Such as?
So HIPAA, which is the medical set of rules that govern patient privacy. So here is how I got access to Leah's medical records. So I tore out a little piece of paper from my spiral notebook, and I wrote on it, "My daughter Leah may look at, no, I'm sorry, Anne Fadiman may look at my daughter Leah's medical records." And this was translated by Mei Ying. And Fua, of course, couldn't write, but she sort of went like this. Then I took that piece of paper to the hospital, and they said, "Here is a key to our medical records room. You may use it after hours." Well, this is before there were any digital records. It was all these folders, I mean, just thousands of them, every single doctor at the hospital. And they said, "Okay, so, here's the Xerox machine, we just charge, I think it was a penny a page or something, it'd keep a record of how many pages you Xerox." I mean, I could have looked at anything there. But of course,
They gave you full reign in
oh yes, well partly, I was Bill's friend, and Bill's friend was never do anything wrong. But I mean, this is just lunatic. Nobody would ever do that now. I also had complete access to all of her legal records at Child Protective Services. But because I also once I got her medical records, which weighed more than 13 pounds, it was 5 volumes, and I know exactly how much it weighed, because evening after evening I'd be, after I'd see the Leahs, it'd be 10 o'clock at night, I'd go to my key, go to the medical records room, I was Xeroxing and Xeroxing. It was so boring. And so once, when I got really bored, I decided to weigh all the volumes on the baby scale in the clinic. Anyway, 13 pounds.
It's a big baby.
Plus, a few ounces. A lot more than Leah weighed when she was born. So I went through all of this stuff, and I went through all the stuff from CPS. And I was, because I knew the various dates when things had happened, and because, if any of you have worked in healthcare, you know that charts are very different now. A lot of it is checking boxes, it's all digital, whereas this was a narrative. It was a story in people's handwriting, and I could tell when they were angry, and I knew the name of every single doctor and every single nurse who had seen Leah over all of these years, so many admissions. And I talked to the foster mother, and I talked to the doctors in Fresno when she went to Fresno. So I was able to find, all kinds of dates
the documents
and so
led
on.
you to the sources
Documents,
of people.
exactly. And then the problem was sort of aligning these things, these sort of the Western narrative with the Leahs narrative, since they didn't use the same system of dates and seasons I did. So I couldn't ask the normal sort of question, "So could you tell me a little bit more about Leah's admission to MCMC on January 12th, 1983? That would mean absolutely nothing. So I'd have to try to find something from the chart about that admission that then would ring a bell for them. Remember that time that you took Leah to the hospital and they didn't put the side of the crib up and she fell out and she got a bump on her head? Oh yes, we remember that. So it was possible to triangulate. But let me just say that I was just I have a couple of my former students here who also heard Catherine Boo speak last week. And one of the great things that Kate Boo said, you've probably all read, at least I hope you've read, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, which was the all-school book
right,
2 years ago. And one of the things she said was, when you write about a social issue, it's especially important to fact-check everything, because if you make a mistake and it becomes known, then everything becomes about you and not about the issue. And I just thought that was the most lucid and marvelous defense of the importance of accuracy that I had heard. So I also hired fact checkers, but I was sort of a demon in trying to get everything right. It was, at first I thought, this is just impossible, because I have these two parallel narratives that are so different from each other. How can I possibly find the intersections? But it turned out that eventually I could, and that's what made it possible to be accurate.
Well, how did you find this intersection? How did you bridge these two narratives together with the history of the Hmong? I mean, this
Well,
a lot in there.
of course, when I was out there doing most of my initial reporting, I didn't know anything about the history of the Hmong. I learned a little bit from some Hmong leaders that I made friends with, Leah Yamua and Jonas Van Gay. But mainly it was after I came back to New York and then spent a couple of years reading that I accumulated the information that I put in the even-numbered chapters. So what those chapters provided, my criterion for what was going to go in those chapters that would be every other chapter, with Leah's narrative being in the odd-numbered chapters. Once I'd decided on that structure, I mean, of course, I could have written a whole book, many people have, on the history of the Hmong. I thought, what might have made each side think differently about the other if they'd known it about the other? That was the criterion.
One of your metaphors was that your story was like the Hmong fish soup. And let's take a break from the questioning, and can I ask you to read an excerpt from the book that talks about,
I would love to.
all the ingredients
love
in this
the fish
yeah,
soup.
Yeah.
Love the fish soup metaphor. Of course, sometimes when I was writing this, because it took so many damn years, I kind of felt I was swimming around in fish soup myself. But a fish soup really did help me understand a great deal about Hmong culture, and had an enormous amount of influence on how I structured the book. In an intermediate French class at Merced College a few years ago, the students were assigned a 5-minute oral report to be delivered in French. The second student to stand up in front of the class was a young Hmong man. His chosen topic was a recipe for la soupe de poisson, fish soup. To prepare fish soup, he said, you must have a fish. And in order to have a fish, you have to go fishing. In order to go fishing, you need a hook. And in order to choose the right hook, you need to know whether the fish you are fishing for lives in fresh or salt water, how big it is, and what shape its mouth is. Continuing in this vein for 45 minutes, the student filled the blackboard with a complexly branching tree of factors and options, a sort of piscatory flowchart written in French with an overlay of Hmong. He also told several anecdotes about his own fishing experiences. He concluded with a description of how to clean various kinds of fish, how to cut them up, and finally, how to cook them in broths flavored with various herbs. When the class period ended, he told the other students that he hoped he had provided enough information, and he wished them good luck in preparing fish soup in the Hmong manner.
So this is a good metaphor for your book. What is the Leahs and the LEAs there in your fish soup? Are they the hook? Are they the fish? Are they?
I think that the fish I was trying to fish for was an understanding of what had gone wrong between the doctors and the Leahs. In other words, the villain of the story was that cross-cultural gap that neither of them was able to cross. I didn't understand at first why things had gone wrong. I thought, gee, these doctors are great. They're both Phi Beta Kappa graduates of Berkeley. They're so smart and their other patients love them, and they really wanted things to go right. And the Leahs were also extremely intelligent and wonderful parents, even though, of course, they had been declared legally negligent by my culture and their daughter had been removed into foster care. But in my view, they were great parents. They taught me how to be a parent. And I thought, you have these really well-intentioned, smart, good people on both sides. What went wrong? That was my fish. And in trying to understand, I mean, the fish soup is the idea that when the Hmong tell a story, they go way, way back, which is why I used fish soup at the beginning of the history chapter. And I was trying in that chapter and in some of the other background chapters about the Hmong to explain some things about Hmong culture. And another reason I wouldn't want to write the book now is that that sort of essentializing, I think, would be deeply inaccurate. When the Hmong first came here as refugees, all at about the same time after the Vietnam War, they were the most homogeneous group ever to come to the United States as refugees or immigrants. They all came from the same country, they all spoke the same language, they all had the same religion, animism, they'd all had the same occupation, farmer or soldier. They all had the same, or about 95% had the same level of education, none. And so it was possible at that time to begin a sentence with the words, the Hmong believe, or even the Hmong are. I would never do that now because there's so much heterogeneity, marvelously so, in education and occupation and geography and degree of assimilation, now that the Hmong have been here so long. But at that time, I felt it was possible to identify mostly by talking to Hmong themselves and by seeing what traits in the Hmong character had been emphasized in Hmong folk tales. That is, it wasn't me sort of thinking, oh, gee, I've known these people for a few months. What do I decide, what are the essential Hmong characteristics? It was more what the Hmong had self-identified as being Hmong traits. And so when I presented the fish soup history, I was going back and back and back to see historically where might some of those traits have come from. The traits that were very important in the case, including stubbornness.
So the key narrative or the narrative spine of your story rests around the Leahs. First of all, how did you find them? When did you find them? At what part of the story? And why did you decide that this was sort of the emblematic case for
Well, here's another great Kate Boo statement. I'm just so high on Kate Boo these days. She was asked, so do you feel that the people that you wrote about were representative of their various groups? And she said, well, I spend a lot of time trying to find representatives, but sadly, all I meet is individuals. So I also meet individuals. I mean, yes, the Leahs and the doctors were, in a way, supposed to be emblematic of their groups, but ultimately, I got to know them so well that I felt I could kind of parse, is Now Cow doing this because he's a Hmong, or is he doing this because he's Now Cow? And ditto for the doctors. But so how I found Leah, for the first couple months in Merced, all starting with the doctors, I asked about some, what are some difficult cases? My original plan was to find a case that was happening right then. It never occurred to me that I could write even a magazine article, let alone a book, about something that was mostly over. Everything I'd ever written, I'd been an eyewitness to. So I kept hearing about this little girl, Leah. There are tons of other cases. I mean, every Hmong case in the hospital went wrong, so I had lots to choose from. But I kept hearing about Leah's case. Some people thought she was dead, but they all said, oh, well, that would be no good for you because her parents are hostile and they're stupid and they're monosyllabic and they hate Americans, and so they won't give you the time of day. So I didn't, but I don't know, it kept coming up. And eventually, when I got a good interpreter after some ones that didn't work out, I went over with Mei Ying to the Leahs, and I just thought the very first night, this is it. I realized that the Leahs had so many details, and that I could probably get enough details from the doctors. I decided immediately, I mean, there were a few rules I set for myself. I wasn't going to make up any quotations. And so, you know, if in an emergency room you might remember 2 words that somebody said, but you're not going to remember a whole dialogue. And I thought, could those scenes come alive without dialogue? So the quotes are in a couple of scenes that I did witness, but mainly the quotes are people recalling what happened. I didn't think that would be vivid enough initially, but ultimately I decided it would. I don't really believe in reconstructing quotations in a work of this sort. I think in memoir it's a little bit different, but not in a reported work. So that was that.
So at what point did you come upon, this was like after her, way long after her?
About a year after she'd had her neurological crisis. So all the memories were still pretty fresh in the family's mind, but they weren't in the middle of an emergency. And when you're in the middle of an emergency, you can't have a conversation that makes sense. So they were in a state of what I would call chronic grief, and I hope none of you ever are in that state, but at least that's a state in which you can have a conversation that makes sense. So she was always just right there with us.
So I have many more questions, but I'd like to have our students, yes, they're already raising their hands. Come up and line up here. Come up, say who you are briefly, and then ask your questions.
Hello, my name is Sharon. I'm a full-time MS student. Thank you so much for coming. The book is wonderful.
Thank you.
I was wondering, you know, considering the wealth of information that you learned, the fish soup and everything, like, how do you decide what actually goes in the book out of this mountain of material? Was there anything that you left out of the book that, you know, even years later you're kind of wondering, like, oh, that would have been so interesting, or it's like hard for you to cut? And how do you decide?
I think it was really helpful that it began as a magazine article, and so I was trying to compress it. If I'd known at the beginning that it was going to be a book, it probably would have ended up being 600 pages. I can't think of anything that I mean, many people ask me that, and it makes me think, well, gee, when they read it, did it seem as if there are a lot of holes? But maybe it's just because the book is so firmly in my mind that it's sort of replaced my personal memories in some way. It's more that there are a few things that I put in the book that I wished I hadn't put in, rather than that there are some things that I left out that I wished I'd put in. So here's an example. And again, I couldn't have known this in advance, but when I was in Minnesota once, I met an anthropologist who knew a Hmong friend of mine, a character in the book named Jonas Van Gay. And Jonas had once told me that his brother had said that he didn't want to take a disabled brother of theirs into his household because in America it's every man for himself. And Jonas had said, no, I am Hmong, and for the Hmong, it's never every man for himself. Now, Jonas saw me taking this down, and he spoke 5 languages and had been to a university in Paris, so he was really better educated than I was. He was one of the few Hmong that I knew for whom informed consent might have the same meaning that it does for all of you, but nonetheless, I don't think he really imagined what kind of effect that would have on his brother if his brother read it. He probably thought his brother would never read it. And also, we had gotten to know each other so well that I think that maybe it was a moment when, even though he saw me writing, it seemed, I think he sort of forgot it was an interview. Anyway, so I heard from this anthropologist, Tim Dunnigan, that the brother had been really, really hurt, and that there had been a falling out between Jonas and his brother because I had put that in. I mean, I never could have guessed that that would cause difficulties, but that still bothers me. There are a couple of things like that. But, when you're deciding what to put in, you have to be really selective, because if you put in everything that's good, everything individually is good, but the pacing is wrong and the book is too long and you can't see the forest for the trees. So you have to force yourself. And so I'm going to bore my two former students here for a moment, but I would like to share with you a concept that has been very important in my classes. I think that this was after your time, Nadja, but not after your time, Zara. So I have a friend, had a friend, a late friend, named Mark O'Donnell, who was a marvelous humor writer, and he won a Tony for writing the book of Hairspray. And he grew up in Cleveland, and when he was growing up, he used to read every week My Weekly Reader, which is a children's magazine, sort of like highlights for children. Bruce is smiling, showing your age, Bruce, that you remember My Weekly Reader. And he told me once that he had read a riddle in My Weekly Reader, and the riddle was, Q, how do you sculpt a statue of David? A, it's easy. You take a block of marble and you remove everything that doesn't look like David. Well, as soon as he told me this, I thought, oh my God, this is just going to change everything. And if any of you ever use this, you cannot use this without properly ascribing it to Mark O'Donnell. He is not the ultimate source. Weekly Reader is the ultimate source, but I wouldn't know this without Mark. And I realized this is going to help me with my writing, and it's also going to help my students with their writing. So I think you need to ask yourself, what am I trying to say? And there might be a lot of really interesting material, but if it doesn't fall under the category of what I am trying to say, it doesn't look like David, and you have to remove the marble.
Elisa.
Hi, my name's Elisa. So before getting into journalism, I worked as an interpreter for several years, and so as I was reading, I thought a lot about, like, wow, this interpreter took on a huge role in the making of this book, and
Yes,
you
she
just
did.
answered a piece of my question, which was, were you able to pay her, and how do you do that as a freelancer, or I guess later on, as you were making a book, but then beyond that, like, how did your relationship with her evolve? Was it easy to get her buy-in, throughout the process?
Yeah. Okay. Well, she wasn't my first interpreter. As you know from the book, I started out with all these, high-status, middle-aged males to kind of raise my status, because I was a young woman when I first went out there. Fua didn't think I was young at all. She thought I should have gotten married about 15 years earlier. But when I look back at myself now, I think of myself as very young. So I started out with these middle-aged male interpreters, and they had their bomb and gun vocabulary was pretty good. They'd been interpreters for the CIA during the Vietnam War, but the rest of their English wasn't very good, and not much got transmitted to me. But Mei Ying was not a professional interpreter. She was a clerk typist at the local refugee agency who'd worked as a babysitter for Dan Murphy, who was one of the doctors at the hospital, who's also still a friend of mine. And Mei Ying is still a very close friend of mine. And I remember telling Dan, I don't know, that things aren't just, I hadn't met the Leahs yet, but I was going around to various Hmong houses and sort of trying to get them to talk about cases that I'd heard of from the doctors. And Dan said, I don't know, she's just really smart, and I think you'd like her, and maybe even though she's never done any professional interpreting, she's so young. She was 20 when I first met her. So she's truly bilingual, and she had a lot of her education here. I think her interpreting might be better, and she doesn't think of herself as important enough to have any agenda of her own, and just meet her. So I took her to lunch, and we immediately hit it off. So I was able to pay her a pretty good hourly fee, because the New Yorker was footing the bill. I remember once being asked by a Hmong man when I was speaking. He said, so you just said that you could not have done the book without Mei Ying. Why didn't she get credit on the cover as co-author, and why doesn't she get half the royalties? It was a good question, and she wasn't my co-author, but it certainly is true that I couldn't have done it without her, because she wasn't interpreting just the words. She was interpreting the culture that lay between the lines of the words. And that was what the doctors had been completely missing, even when they had, decent medical interpreting, which was not most of the time. In terms of buying in, she was at the beginning so young and so sort of fascinated by this whole process that there was never any buying in. We were a team. And after every night at the Leahs, we'd go out and we'd sit in my little rented car and, you know, I'd ask her questions and she'd sort of explain cultural things I didn't get between the lines of the words. And then the last chapter in the book, which is about a Neng ceremony for Leah, animal sacrifice, it was so complicated. I knew I wasn't going to know what was happening, and so I asked her husband Pang to videotape it, or at least until we got to the most sacred part. The shaman didn't want that to be videotaped, and then we took the tape back to Mei Ying's mother's house, and Meiko Zhang, her mother, was the widow of a really famous Tsineng, as I mentioned, and knew a lot about Hmong shamanism. And we just watched that tape over and over and over again and kept stopping and replaying. And she translated the whole thing and then kind of explained to me what was going on. I had no idea what was going on. I knew what I was seeing, but my written notes are just crappy from that because I didn't know the meaning of anything that I was seeing, so I missed a lot. But it was sort of amazing years after that had happened to be able to plug that video cassette into the VCR, and there it all was. So Meiko was very important too. And
did you do simultaneous translations and then translate again when you needed the exact codes? For your book?
well, you know, not simultaneous, but
Not simultaneous, but consecutive, yeah.
consecutive. I mean, the only thing where we went back was on the video. I also had tapes of everything, but I didn't have to play those again to Mei Ying because she'd already translated the words really well. But I would often ask her to explain, you know, why did Nao Kao say such and such. But just to catch you up on Mei Ying, so when I first met her, she hadn't gone to college, and she got extremely interested in Hmong health issues because of working with me on this book. And she has now just recently, just in June, finished a nursing PhD program at UC Davis, to which they accepted only 6 students. It's a famous program. So I have only a BA. She has a doctorate now. And it took her, she's got 4 kids and a complicated life. It took her a lot of time to get through it, but she did. So she turned out to be a really, really important person in the Hmong community, not just in the Central Valley, but Mei Ying Zhongli, as she refers to herself now, is a name that many Hmong all across the country know. So I just lucked into this amazing, amazing person. And when I go, the Leahs have moved to Sacramento, and so did Mei Ying, and they live only a few blocks apart. So I've stayed with her and her family many times when I've gone to see the Leahs.
Yes, please.
Hi, Anne. My name's Isabel. I was just wondering, I'm quite obsessed with the placenta as an opener and how you chose it, because obviously you had all these years of research, and it strikes me as the perfect way to introduce the ignorant reader into this aspect of Hmong animism, and also the exact pinpoint of where Hmong culture and American healthcare kind of converge, and where they conflict. And how did you choose the placenta as your starting point, especially given you don't start until you know what you're going to write?
Right.
First.
I guess I thought of the beginning as not specifically about the placenta, though the placenta is very important, but as about birth. I use a thesaurus a lot, and in the recent editions of Roget's International Thesaurus, there are about 1,000 categories, and the first one is birth. At the moment, the last one is space travel, and when Peter Marc Roget did the first edition of the thesaurus in 1852. The category of space travel didn't exist. But anyway, I used the thesaurus a lot doing this book, and it was just really wonderful. Category 1, birth. I knew really early on how the book would begin and end. I knew I wanted to begin it with birth, and I wanted to end it with the Neng ceremony, which was one of the few things in the book that I actually got to see myself. So I could have a lot of really, really rich detail there. And once Meiko Zhang had translated those words of the soul caller, calling out to Leah's soul, come home, come home, come home, come home, come home, I knew those would be the last words of the book, even though it took me years to get to write those words. But I wanted to begin with birth because I thought if I could compare the way Leah's siblings had been born in Laos, her older siblings, with the way she was born. I mean, I think I got the idea because the first thing in her chart at MCMC was the description. I mean, she'd been born at that same hospital. It was a description of her birth. It was literally on the first page. And I thought, oh, wow, I actually have the record of her birth. Like, what her APGAR scores were and what her weight was. And so I then asked Fua, well, what were the births of her older siblings like? And I'd had absolutely no idea until I asked her that question. And she got down on the floor and acted it out for me. So, I mean, I could see exactly how she would catch the babies herself on the dirt floor. And I then realized, oh, I can actually say not just her siblings were born this way and she was born this way, and that would immediately introduce sort of the Hmong way and the Western medical way. You'd have those two opposite poles right in the first few pages, but I realized I could say, if Leah had been born in the mountains of Laos, this is how it would have happened. And I just remember realizing, oh, the first word of the book could be if. I think the first word of the book is if, and that just seemed a really cool first word. As far as the placenta went, that was something that I heard about from the Leahs, but also had later read a lot about, and that the doctors in the hospital were very confused about why did they want to take their placenta home. And it seemed to me sort of emblematic, just incredibly poignant and tragic, that they had had this terribly long traumatic journey from their villages. Everything had been completely messed up by our war, and they'd lost everything they owned, and they lost their country, they lost their village, everything. They'd had to come here, but that when you're born, your placenta gets buried, and that when you die, your soul has to be called back, backwards, 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 through every place you've been in your life, back to that placenta. And I loved that the word for placenta is the same as the word for jacket. So the placenta was very important, but I thought of the beginning as a beginning about birth. We're starting right at the beginning here with Leah's birth and immediately setting up this contrast between two modes of thinking.
Meg?
Hi, Anne. I'm Meg Kissinger, visiting professor here. And we had a great discussion about your book.
Oh,
and
thank you.
One of my favorite things actually was in the afterword that you wrote, and it's so beautiful. I just wanted to repeat it and ask you to comment on it. And you
Sure.
said, empathy is hard. It's harder than anger. It's harder than pity.
Yeah, boy, pity is really easy. Those poor Hmong. Oh my God, aren't they poor? They lost everything and we really screwed them. That is so easy. Anger is easy. I did spend some time being angry at my characters. I mean, I spent so many years, there would be periods when I'd sort of want to, shake Fu by the shoulders and say, why didn't you realize that the doctors were so well-intentioned? And then I certainly wanted to shake the doctors by the shoulders and say, there were some other things you could have done, and, foster care. But mostly I wasn't angry at the characters. Those would just be little brief storms. My essential extreme affection for both sides would, come out a few days later. But I was really angry at the United States, really, really angry. And in our current refugee crisis, it's almost like having an anniversary reaction to the traumatic death of someone you love. A lot of my feelings of anger at my country for what they did to the Hmong and how they screwed up their resettlement have been just, kind of unbidden, just sort of seeping out and making me feel angry again. So anyway, those feelings are easy. They just come. You don't have to make them happen, and sometimes, in fact, you try to make them not happen. Empathy is hard because it's different from sympathy. I mean, you really have to put yourself into the other person's point of view. And that is not so easy, especially with the Leahs, because they're just so different from me. I come from this super intellectual, rational family where all problems could be solved by being cerebral. And Neil and Peggy were cerebral, and they failed in solving that problem. So in order to see things from the Leahs' point of view, I had to give up a lot of the things that I'd clung to my entire life, that were sort of my bulwark, that made me feel safe and strong. I realized that there are a lot of situations in which they're just completely worthless. And I also, I guess, feel that many of the world's problems couldn't exactly be solved, but would be much improved via empathy. I mean, I don't think it's a panacea, but I do think that it helps, and I think that many people confuse it with pity. And when people pity other people, there's immediately a hierarchy, and the pitier is always higher than the pitiee. And the point about empathy is that by very definition, you have to be exactly on the same level because you're aligned.
Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Sure.
Isn't empathy also dangerous sometimes? Too much empathy? Is there such a thing as excessive empathy or errors of judgment or perception
No, I think
because of being too empathetic?
I think you can burn out because when you're feeling empathy, you're taking other people's problems onto yourself. It can certainly happen for journalists. It can certainly also happen for doctors. But I think that in terms of writing good journalism, that excessive sympathy is a greater danger than excessive empathy. I'm not sure that, again, if you're writing a news story, that's an entirely different kettle of fish, because empathy ruins your objectivity because it puts you inside that other person. But when you're writing the whatever genre this is, I don't think that empathy ever caused any problems. I think that pity causes enormous problems.
Hello, my name's Michelle. Thank you for coming and speaking with us. Something I think you did really beautifully in the book was tying yourself into the narrative. It must have been a hard thing to do, You started off by not doing that, and then you came in and you were very honest about the way you were reporting and the way you were interacting with the family. Over this long immersive reporting experience, how did you go about not becoming too much of a presence in their lives so as to affect the story that you wrote, and how did you maintain that sort of, that distance as a writer, because you didn't want to intervene, or were there situations where you did intervene? And
Yeah, I explained earlier that by the time I came on the scene, Leah was already in a vegetative state, and I've often wondered if I'd come a couple years earlier, what would have happened. I don't think I would have been able to resist intervening, and I don't think it would have helped, and it would have ruined my book, although that would have been the least of the problems. My book was trivial compared with Leah's life. But I don't think it would have helped. But there wasn't anything important medically going on when I arrived. That is, Leah was in a sort of steady state, a very sad steady state, but there weren't any emergencies. So it was pretty easy not to take the initiative because nothing was happening that I thought I could prevent. Nothing bad was happening. The Leahs never asked me about the doctors. That is, they were not interested in having me explain the doctors to them. And so it was very easy for me not to take the initiative. But the doctors were very curious about the Leahs, and so they did ask me, and they were just amazed as I started telling them what they were doing. Animal sacrifices, what they thought this, what they thought that, they had no idea. And so I was sort of filling Neil and Peggy, and of course Bill, who'd also taken care of Leah, was hearing everything on a nightly basis. And so it wasn't a question of intervening, but sort of, I would just answer Neil and Peggy's questions, but that was not really going to change anything at that point. They already had a pretty good relationship with the Leahs. It got even better after I went back to New York. I think I have a scene in the book. It was when Neil and Peggy's, one of their two sons, got leukemia, and Peggy had somehow, Fua had somehow heard, I don't know how, but that one of Neil and Peggy's kids was really sick, and she brought Leah in just for a routine checkup. I wasn't there. I was in New York. Neil wrote me a letter about it. And again, it was an actual letter, pre-email. And I think there was a medical interpreter in the room, but certainly one wasn't needed. And Fua just walked over to Peggy and put her arms around her, and they both cried. And it wasn't, they'd had nothing in common before this point, just absolutely nothing, not education or, language, background, religion, or their views on how Leah should be treated. But they had motherhood in common, and motherhood of really seriously ill children. And the amazing thing was that before that point, I'd heard each woman say thousands and thousands of negative words about the other. But after that, never a single one. It was that moment, really, of empathy that just changed everything for them. But I guess I'm really glad that I was not put to the test of sort of, am I going to compromise my journalistic stance by intervening and changing the course of the story? Or am I just going to watch a train crash? I didn't have to make that terrible choice, because by the time I came, they were beyond that kind of decision making.
Thank you.
Can I ask what you would have done?
If I had come 2 years earlier,
Yeah.
I would have intervened. I would have, just the sort of person that I am, I just would have, I don't think it would have done any good, but I just couldn't have resisted. I think I would have made all kinds of suggestions to both sides, and that would have sort of ruined my relationship with the Leahs, because then I would have been more like the doctors, telling them what to do instead of being the ignorant, naive person that they were enlightening.
You just couldn't watch a disaster.
No.
About to happen.
It's, you're the photographer and you see the guy about to jump from the bridge. Of course, you don't take the picture, you save the guy. Except, I wouldn't have saved anybody, but just in my, usual meddlesome way, I don't think I could have resisted. But I don't think I would have done any good. And then, of course, I would have had to put in the book what I had said and done. I couldn't have left that out, because I would have affected the course of things, but I think I would have just messed things up.
Hi. While I was reading, I was amazed at the fact that the question of the language is pretty much interwoven in the plot and in the story, as opposed to being openly faced. Like, why did these people not learn any English, not even spoken, right? And as I went on reading, I understood that in fact it was interwoven, and it was part of the immersive reporting that you were doing, that it was never openly, like faced as an issue to deal with, like to write about or to even question, because it was who they were and the peculiar story that they've had as people and as refugees. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on if there were any like competing voices that you might have heard from, I don't know, refugee, people with opinions on refugees that might have insisted more on the aspect of the language as a means to integration, and whether you would write the same way were you reporting today on refugees?
Yeah, it depends who the refugees were. First of all, Fua and Nakau didn't learn English, but all of their children did. So as each successive child was born, and the ones who had already been born and went to school, pretty much the majority of the people in that apartment spoke English. Sure, I heard from all kinds of people, why don't the Hmong learn English? And I'm sure I quoted a couple, though not specifically about the Leahs. I don't think that learning English would have helped Fua and Nakau. They had their children to translate for them, and they lived in a Hmong neighborhood, and they didn't want to assimilate. They didn't want to become American. They couldn't be in Laos. And it was either, and they couldn't have stayed forever in a refugee camp in Thailand. They didn't want to be in the United States. And if they were going to be in the United States, the best way to insulate them from more tragedy and trauma was to make the United States as Hmong an experience for them as possible. They were old, they had some physical problems. It's hard to imagine what jobs they would have had if they had worked. Fua did make some money as a pandao artist. She did really wonderful work with textiles, but of course, fairly soon, Leah had her first seizure when she was 3 months old. They came to the United States in 1980, and Leah was born in 1982, and pretty much right away needed care. They also just had tons of little children all the time, so there's no way that Fua was going to be working outside the home. I think that they were going to be happiest living in a Hmong community where everyone around them spoke Hmong. That's not true of their children. Their children don't want to go back to Laos, unlike Fua. Nakau's no longer alive. Fua would love to be buried in Laos. She misses it every day. Her children are really glad that they had an American education and they have good jobs and so on. One of the reasons that I didn't comment was that I was pretty much aligned with Fua, even though I know that there are many, many arguments against that view, but I just can't, again, this is very specific to them, and I think that most immigrants and refugees have a much more successful time in the United States if they immediately start taking English classes. That's 99.9%, but these were in the 0.1.
So we have one last question, and then I'll ask another question
Okay,
after
great.
that, if I may. Yes, Adil.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
So we're in a reporting class right now, and a lot of us are covering immigration or ethnic communities, and I was wondering if you had some advice for people that are covering refugee communities.
Okay, don't think of them as victims. You can, many, many traumatic things have happened to them that were not of their own making, but that does not make them victims. The very fact that they got here, that they are trying strenuously to create new lives for themselves and their families, makes them incredibly strong, even though they are encountering failures on a daily basis. And to think of them only as people who are done unto, rather than people who have initiative and power and strength and some degree of autonomy, is to continue to insult them. When you think of everything that they've lost, greater than the losses of their material possessions and their country and their livelihoods is their sense of power and autonomy. They've been forced into such diminished roles by their refugee status. So the best thing that you can do is treat them with the respect that they deserve, because they are dealing so incredibly well, even though, as I said, they may be failing all the time, but nonetheless, they are dealing so incredibly well and with such incredible strength with situations that would probably fell most of us. I think that changes everything when you think of them not as weak people who've lost everything, but as powerful people who still have so much because of who they are.
Thank you.
I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative by asking two final questions
Sure.
just to round this up. So one is, what is your responsibility to the people you wrote about after the book has been published? And the second is, can you tell us what's happened to the Leahs, what
Sure.
happened to Leah,
Sure.
and what happened to the Hmongs 20 years after your story was published?
Okay, and so I'll probably ask you to ask the second question again. I will have forgotten it by the time I answer the first. First of all, they're not a monolith. The Leahs are a really large family, and their children, there are a lot of children, and they're very different from each other, and some are very well educated, and others who were the oldest when they first moved to the United States, less so. Just to jump ahead a moment, all of Leah's siblings, all the ones who had most of their education in the United States, have gone to college, which is just unbelievable. And one of them, Mai, has graduated from UC Davis, very selective university. So the kids are different from each other, and they all have different viewpoints. So I'm particularly close to May and to True. And True and Yer and 4 of their friends have visited us in Massachusetts, and True and a cousin of hers visited me at Yale last year, which was just mind-blowing. They are were sort of in it with me, sort of like Mei Ying. They would often sit when I was doing the interviews. They learned a lot about their families, experiences that their parents had never told them. But some of the other kids, when they went to college, I think found it pretty annoying, and I would have too if I'd been them, that Anglo students would come up to them and sort of act as if they knew everything about them and everything about Leah. And of course, Leah's story looked completely different to them, and for the younger ones, Leah's story is pretty much what happened after she was in a vegetative state, not before, because they don't remember those earlier years. So there are all kinds of points of view. I'm still friends with all of them, but they don't all agree. And certainly, I guess at the beginning, it was sometimes reporters would call them at their home, and it was better when they moved to Sacramento. Not that they did it for that reason, but so for many years, I didn't ever say when I was giving a speech where they lived, because I didn't want anybody to know. But then when Leah died a few years back, and they chose to have her written about by the paper in Sacramento. So at that point, everybody knew, so I didn't have to hide it.
She died at the age of 30, right?
She died at the age of 30 of aspiration pneumonia, and she'd been in a vegetative state since she was 4. Have any of you worked in healthcare? Okay, so have you ever dealt with anyone in a vegetative state? So you know how just completely extraordinary it is to care for someone at home in a vegetative state for 26 years. First of all, most vegetative patients die really soon. They just wither away. So just keep anybody alive under any circumstances for 26 years. It just boggles the mind. But at home, I've spent so many, hundreds of hours watching them take care of Leah and feed Leah. Just, it takes 24/7, took 24/7 to take care of her. Anyway, she did die, and
you kept in touch with the family.
Oh yes, all through, and saw them. whenever I could, when I, had a story in California, I'd try to go see them. And True and May, and sometimes My, often, once email was invented, they would email me, and I'm still in touch by email. But I'd always wondered how I would feel when Leah died. I'd expected her to die, for many years, and I was taken aback at how much I was affected by it. It's hard to explain. I mean, Leah and I have never had a conversation. She was never aware of my existence, but very few people have changed my life more than she did. And also, she really had a presence. She was, in the early, she got very wizened and awful looking in later years, but when I first met her, she was just incredibly sort of beautiful and fragrant and just a lovely child that you just wanted to hold on your lap. And when I would visit in later years, I would always spend time alone with Leah. She'd usually be in the living room, but if she was in the bedroom, I would go in, I'd talk to her. I never had any illusions that she could hear, but nonetheless, she meant something to me, and her family's love for her had taught me so much about what makes a person, and who is a person of value. I mean, my own family, this rational, intellectual family that I grew up in, would have thought that Leah's life was completely worthless, as the doctors did when they kept slipping up and saying that she was dead. I mean, in their view, she was dead, but not in her family's view. And their grief made me realize even more how precious a human being she was, even though she couldn't, do anything. It wasn't all about doing stuff. It was about being someone. And so her funeral and her burial, just really made me incredibly sad.
So finally, what happened to the Hmong 20 years later?
Okay, well, I don't really know. I'm just an amateur now, thank God. I don't have to keep up on this. So, I hang out with my Hmong friends. I guess the quick answer is that if you were to meet some young Hmong who were your age, you'd think they were really Americanized. They would dress like everybody here. They'd fit right into this audience if they'd been to college, as many have. So the young ones have been sort of assimilated. Their grandparents would probably say, oh, they're too American. But if you sort of peeled back some layers, I think you'd find that they're still very Hmong in the best ways. Hmong still mostly marry other Hmong. And at the important milestones, a birth and marriage, death and illness, many of the old traditions are still practiced. If you went to a Hmong community, you might not see them being practiced. They're behind walls, but they're still going on. Perhaps most importantly, that marvelous sense of taking care of each other, that group solidarity, that sense of generations of families taking care of each other, the clan taking care of other people, that is just still absolutely there. So it's still so rare for an elderly Hmong, your great-grandmother to be sent off to a nursing home, just the way, Leah always stayed at home and was taken care of. And now maybe again I sound as if I'm essentializing. And I guess I am, because that sense of it's not every man for himself, that American sentence that Jonas Van Gay was so upset about when his brother said it, that's still there. And that has really changed my view about all kinds of things. If you're Hmong, you were your brother's keeper, and not just your brothers, your cousins, and that other clan member who lives in another town, and maybe that other Hmong who isn't even a clan member but needs your help. And it just made me feel that Americans are really narrow and tight and selfish by comparison. And if I've opened up,
I see a lot of people nodding here in the room.
if I've opened up at all in my life, I owe it entirely to them.
Thank you so much. Anne Fadiman, ladies and gentlemen.